What would you do if the person you hired to help you stole everything you worked for? Marco adjusted the faded sign on the front door of his store, a daily ritual that brought him an odd sense of pride. The store, located in a modest corner of Aurora, Colorado, had become a beacon of reliability in the neighborhood. It wasn't just a place to pick up groceries or household essentials. For many, it was a hub of warmth and familiarity. Marco had poured 10 years of his life into building it, brick by metaphorical brick. From day one, Marco wanted this place to feel like more than a business. Growing up, his family had always struggled to find a grocery store nearby that felt welcoming, let alone one that catered to their needs. When he finally had the chance to start his own, he vowed to change that narrative. His store was stocked with everything from affordable produce to hard-to-find spices that reflected the neighborhood's diversity. The community loved him for it. His regulars, Mrs. Thompson, who always came in for her favorite brand of tea, or young Miguel, who saved up his allowance for comic books on the front display, made Marco feel like his work truly mattered. "You're not just a store owner, Marco," Mrs. Thompson had once told him. "You're family." But even as his business flourished, Marco understood the weight of his success. Running the store wasn't just about making ends meet. It was about defying expectations in a world that hadn't always been kind. Being a black man in the entrepreneurial space meant dealing with constant whispers of doubt, occasional glares, and the unspoken question, can he really make it? Yet Marco didn't let it faze him. His dedication, his long nights balancing books, and his Saturdays spent restocking shelves instead of relaxing spoke for themselves. His business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And that's what made him proudest of all. When the business grew beyond what he could handle alone, Marco decided it was time to bring on a manager. The decision wasn't easy. He needed someone who would treat the store with the same care he did. That's when Brent came into the picture. Brent, with his polished resume and confident demeanor, seemed like the perfect fit. During the interview, he'd spoken of his years in retail management and his understanding of customer service. "I know what it takes to make a place like this run like a well-oiled machine," he'd said, leaning back in his chair with a practiced smile. Marco had felt a flicker of doubt but brushed it aside. Everyone deserved a chance, right? Brent started strong, diving into inventory processes and improving efficiency. Marco thought he'd made the right call. But something about Brent's attitude lingered at the back of Marco's mind. Subtle things, like the way he spoke to certain customers or how his tone shifted when Marco wasn't around. Marco wanted to believe it was just his imagination. But sometimes, instincts aren't wrong. They just take time to reveal the truth. It started small, so small that Marco didn't even notice at first. Brent had a knack for taking charge, which wasn't inherently bad. In fact, Marco appreciated having someone he could delegate to. But over time, Brent's confidence turned into something else. Control. There was the way he casually dismissed Marco's input during staff meetings, rephrasing ideas as if they were his own, or how he began implementing changes to the store layout without consulting Marco first. The staff, who had always felt comfortable sharing their thoughts with Marco, began tiptoeing around Brent. "Brent's got some good ideas," Marco thought to himself, giving him the benefit of the doubt. After all, the numbers weren't suffering, and the customers didn't seem to notice any difference. Then came the incident with Mrs. Thompson. She'd been a loyal customer since the store opened, and Marco always made a point of greeting her when she came in. One afternoon, Marco was restocking the snack aisle when he heard raised voices near the checkout. "I've been shopping here for years. Who do you think you are?" Mrs. Thompson's voice cracked with frustration. Brent stood behind the counter, arms crossed. "Ma'am, I'm just following store policy. If you can't produce the receipt, I can't let you walk out with the items." Marco stepped in immediately, diffusing the situation and reassuring Mrs. Thompson that she was always welcome. After she left, Marco pulled Brent aside. "Brent, I know you're trying to do your job, but Mrs. Thompson is one of our regulars. She's never caused trouble here, Marco said calmly. Brent shrugged. Policy is policy. If you want to play favorites, that's your call, but it sets a bad precedent. The words stung. Marco brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to Brent's rigid personality. But moments like that began piling up, each one leaving Marco with an uneasy feeling he couldn't quite shake. Then, the tipping point came one evening when Marco decided to stop by the store after hours. He wasn't there to check up on anyone. He simply needed to grab a few papers he'd left in his office. As he unlocked the back door, he was startled to find Brent standing inside, glaring at him like an intruder. "What are you doing here?" Brent demanded. Marco raised an eyebrow. "It's my store, Brent. I just came to grab something from the office." Brent didn't budge. "You can't just walk in after hours without notifying me first. That's not how this works." Marco blinked, caught off guard by the audacity of the statement. "Brent, I don't need your permission to enter my own business." But Brent's expression didn't soften. "You might own the place, but when I'm running the floor, I'm in charge. You're setting a bad example by ignoring protocol." The exchange left Marco speechless. Was this the same man he'd hired with high hopes just months ago? He tried to let it go, but the tension between them only grew. A few weeks later, Marco received a call from one of his longtime suppliers. "Hey, Marco, just wanted to confirm the change in payment terms you requested," the supplier said. "Change? I didn't request any changes," Marco replied, his stomach tightening. The supplier hesitated. "Brent said it was approved by you." That was the moment Marco realized he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Brent wasn't just overstepping, he was actively undermining Marco's authority. The final blow came on a Monday morning. Marco arrived at the store to find Brent waiting for him, arms folded and a smirk on his face. "We need to talk," Brent said, motioning Marco toward the office. Inside, Brent handed Marco a piece of paper. "You've been trespassing on store property after hours. I can't allow that to continue." Marco's jaw tightened as he read the document. It was a formal warning, issued to him, the owner of the store. "You're serious?" Marco asked, his voice low and steady. "Very serious," Brent replied. "If you can't follow the rules, maybe you shouldn't be here at all." The words hit Marco like a punch to the gut. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. But the worst part wasn't the insult. It was the realization that Brent had been plotting this for some time. But sometimes being blindsided is the first step toward clarity. Marco sat in his car outside the store, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stared at the sign he had hung up with his own hands years ago. It was more than a business to him. It was a piece of his heart, a symbol of everything he'd worked so hard to achieve. And now, someone else was trying to take it away. For the first time in years, Marco felt powerless. The humiliation of being ejected from his own store by someone he had hired cut deeper than any insult he had ever faced. But it wasn't just the embarrassment, it was the sheer injustice of it all. He replayed the conversation with Brent over and over in his mind, each word stinging more than the last. How could someone twist the narrative so completely? Brent had manipulated the situation, turning Marco into the outsider in his own story. The anger boiled inside him, threatening to consume him. But Marco knew he couldn't afford to act on impulse. That's not who he was. His parents had always taught him that dignity wasn't about what people did to you. It was about how you chose to respond. So Marco took a deep breath and made a decision. He wasn't going to let Brent win, but he also wasn't going to stoop to Brent's level. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was his, the right way. That evening, Marco sat down at his kitchen table with a notepad and pen. He started by writing out everything he could remember about Brent's behavior. The subtle digs in staff meetings, the incident with Mrs. Thompson, the unauthorized changes to supplier agreements, and finally, the blatant lie that led to his removal. Marco's hands shook as he wrote, but not with anger this time. It was determination. He realized he had allowed Brent to take control, to make him question his own instincts. But no more. The next step was research. Marco spent hours online looking up labor laws, tenant rights, and small business regulations. He learned that as the property owner and employer, Brent's actions were not only unethical, they were illegal. Then Marco began reaching out to people he trusted, his accountant, who confirmed irregularities in Brent's financial decisions, a lawyer who assured Marco that he had a strong case if he wanted to pursue legal action, and his employees, who started sharing their own experiences with Brent's bullying tactics. One conversation stood out. A part-time cashier named Chloe confided in Marco about how Brent had been treating customers differently based on their appearance. "It's like he's got this chip on his shoulder," she said, "and he's been telling us not to bother calling you about anything because you're too hands-off." Marco felt a pang of guilt. He had trusted Brent to manage the store, but in doing so, he had allowed someone else to tarnish the culture he had worked so hard to create. Still, guilt wasn't going to solve anything. Marco knew what he had to do. Armed with evidence and a renewed sense of purpose, he started formulating a plan. It wasn't enough to confront Brent. Marco needed to show the community, his employees, and even himself, that he was still the rightful leader of the store. He began documenting everything, from emails to financial discrepancies to witness statements. He even invested in a security system that allowed him to monitor the store remotely, capturing footage that backed up his claims. Through it all, Marco reminded himself of one thing. This wasn't just about getting the store back. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds felt stacked against him. Because sometimes, the road to justice starts with quiet resolve. Marco's plan unfolded with the same precision and care he had once used to build his store from the ground up. He understood that if he wanted to win, he needed more than passion. He needed proof. The first step was addressing Brent's lies about the store's policies. Marco combed through company records, emails, and employee handbooks. He found no documentation that supported Brent's accusations about trespassing policies. In fact, Marco had clear evidence in past memos that he, as the owner, had unrestricted access to the store at any time. Next, Marco focused on Brent's interactions with suppliers. A meeting with his accountant revealed discrepancies in invoices, changes Brent had made without Marco's approval. Some vendors had been charged more, while others received unexplained discounts. Marco also noticed an unusually large order for certain items that the store had no record of selling. With this evidence, Marco reached out to the suppliers themselves. One by one, they confirmed that Brent had been authorizing deals behind Marco's back. A few even admitted they felt uneasy about Brent's demeanor, but had complied because he claimed to be fixing Marco's mistakes. Still, Marco knew this wasn't enough. He needed to expose Brent's behavior in a way that couldn't be disputed. That's where the employees came in. Marco arranged discreet one-on-one meetings with each staff member. What he heard was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Chloe, the part-time cashier, shared how Brent had berated her in front of customers for minor mistakes. A stockroom worker named Luis admitted he had been working extra hours without pay because Brent forgot to log his overtime. Even more troubling were the stories from customers who felt unwelcome or mistreated by Brent's abrasive attitude. One story stood out. A middle-aged man named Clarence, who often stopped by for snacks after his shift at the nearby factory, recounted how Brent had accused him of loitering and called the police. Clarence had stopped coming to the store altogether after that incident. Marco's stomach churned as he listened to each account. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the community he had built the store to serve. With a growing file of evidence, Marco decided it was time to involve the law. His lawyer, a sharp but approachable woman named Denise, was more than ready to take on the case. "Marco, "This isn't just a labor dispute," she said during their first meeting. "Brent's actions are discriminatory and abusive. We're going to make that crystal clear." Denise helped Marco draft a formal complaint against Brent, citing breach of contract, discrimination, and unauthorized business practices. She also advised Marco to prepare for potential backlash. "Brent won't go quietly," she warned, "but we'll be ready." As Marco prepared to serve Brent the legal documents, he took one last step to ensure his case was ironclad. He installed cameras in the store, capturing footage of Brent's daily interactions with customers and employees. What the recordings revealed was worse than Marco had anticipated. One clip showed Brent scolding a young mother for taking too long at the checkout, muttering something under his breath about people like her. Another showed him ignoring a black teenager asking for help while enthusiastically assisting a white customer moments later. These weren't isolated incidents, they were patterns. Marco knew the footage would be the nail in the coffin. With Denise's guidance, he compiled everything into a comprehensive case: the financial discrepancies, employee testimonies, customer complaints, and video evidence. The day Marco confronted Brent was one he would never forget. He walked into the store, legal documents in hand, and found Brent at the counter, barking orders at an employee. Brent looked up, surprised to see Marco. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone sharp. Marco held his ground. "I'm here to reclaim my store," he said, his voice steady, "and this time, I've got the proof to back it up." He handed Brent the stack of papers, watching as the manager's confident facade began to crumble. Brent flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each line he read. "This is ridiculous," Brent scoffed. "You think you can just waltz in here and—" "Yes, I can," Marco interrupted, his voice firm. "Because this is my business. My name is on the lease, the bank accounts, and the payroll. You might have thought you could take that from me, but you were wrong." Brent's bluster quickly turned to desperation as he realized the depth of Marco's evidence. With Denise by his side, Marco made it clear that Brent had two choices: resign quietly or face a lawsuit that would ruin his career. For the first time since Marco had hired him, Brent had nothing to say. He packed his things and left without another word. Marco stood in the middle of his store, letting the reality of the moment sink in. It wasn't a victory won through anger or revenge. It was justice. He had taken back what was his, not just for himself, but for his employees and the community. But even victories like this come with lessons that linger long after the battle is over. Marco stood behind the counter of his store, a place that finally felt like his again. The air was lighter, the tension that Brent had brought with him gone. Employees who once walked on eggshells now moved with ease, chatting and laughing as they restocked shelves and greeted customers. It felt like coming home after a long storm. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the neighborhood. Longtime customers like Mrs. Thompson returned, eager to support Marco and his business. Even Clarence, who had avoided the store after his run-in with Brent, stopped by to shake Marco's hand. "It's good to see you back where you belong," Clarence said with a warm smile. Marco didn't just rebuild, he reinvented. He brought his staff together to ensure everyone felt valued and respected. Policies were updated to reflect the inclusive, community-first environment Marco had always envisioned. Employees were encouraged to voice their concerns and ideas, knowing their input mattered. But the experience had left its mark on Marco. He couldn't forget the anger and betrayal he'd felt when Brent tried to strip away everything he had worked for. Yet in that pain, he found strength. The ordeal reminded him of the importance of standing up, not just for himself but for the people who relied on him, the employees who counted on their jobs, the customers who saw his store as a safe haven, and the neighborhood that deserved better. Marco shared his story at a local town meeting, speaking not out of bitterness, but to inspire others. He reminded everyone of the power of perseverance and the importance of staying true to one's values. "No one can take away what's yours if you're willing to fight for it," he said. "But the fight has to come from a place of fairness and integrity, not anger or revenge." As he looked out at the faces of his community, Marco felt a deep sense of pride. His store wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of resilience and justice. It was proof that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, can make all the difference. For Marco, the experience wasn't just about reclaiming his store. It was about reclaiming his purpose. He had faced adversity and come out stronger, not because he had defeated someone else, but because he had stayed true to himself. And as customers filed in that day, one after another offering their support, Marco realized something important. Justice doesn't always come easily, but when it does, it has the power to heal wounds, rebuild trust, and inspire change. So the next time life throws a challenge your way, remember Marco's story. Stand your ground, fight with integrity, and never lose sight of what's right. And if this story moved you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it to spread the message.